speaker tonight is Steven Anderson. Steven Anderson is someone that I've known for a long time. I could actually just say he needs no introduction and then get off the stage. Steven's written several books. He's keynoted at conferences. Here's what I'll tell you about Steven. This is a man that I respect for a couple of reasons. He gives to the community. He's a really good thinker, but I think more importantly, he's a teacher. And sometimes he will lead the way for all of us and say, this is what we need to do. This is maybe a new way to approach our work. And tonight he's going to talk about facilitating structures. So please give it up for Steven Anderson.
Before I get started, I have handouts for everyone, so I'll just take one and pass it around. I think it was Edward Tufte who said you should put your entire presentation on a piece of paper, so everyone has it in their hands. So those are all the essential parts, but the interesting parts will be up here, hopefully. So a little bit of background. So I want to say I'm thrilled to see you all out here, mostly, or for a lot of reasons, but mostly because this is a personal talk, and it's a very opinionated talk. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end tonight, and then afterwards. In fact, at the end, I'll put my email address up, and I welcome emails or things you can tell me, like, that was awesome. You can tell me that was so terrible, you're wrong for these reasons. Whatever, I'm looking forward to the dialogue that will follow this. All right. So the talk is facilitating structures toward a new way of working and learning together. And like I said, this is a bit of a personal talk. So the best place to start is probably with my personal mission statement. Probably won't mean a lot to others, but this, for me, I landed on this about 6 months ago, and it crystallizes everything that I am working for now and trying to realize. So my mission is to make learning the hard stuff fun by making things to think with and spaces for generative play. And as we go through this talk, I think this will mean a lot more, and you'll see how that's come to life in different ways. One thing I do want to do from the get-go, though, is set expectations. There are presentations that end with like 5 bullet points, or presentations that end with a framework or something to do, or some questions to think about. This is not necessarily that style of presentation. Rather, what I'm hoping to do is kind of change your perspective or offer you a different frame or a different way of looking at the work you already do. So think of it like putting on a pair of 3D glasses or virtual reality goggle headset, look about that way. What I want to offer is a lens by which to view the work that we already do, to reconsider the work that we already do, and then perhaps in the reconsidering and seeing things in a new way, see new things that we haven't seen before. That's really the promise or the takeaway from this talk. So let's get started. And I'm going to start with a bit of a proposition. What if we could change the world? I'm only going to see what comes next, right? What if we could change the world by playing more board games? No, seriously. And those of you who know me, I've given a number of talks over the years talking about connections between board games and design or board games and UX. This is not one of those talks, but I thought this was good to open with how I see board games and what I see in them. And so a bit of an argument for this. We know that strategy games help us understand complex systems, and we have more and more complex systems that we're working inside of. And so understanding a bit about how systems work would be really useful. We know that board games create active, engaged participants, like what cardboard and paper and some plastic pieces can do for 2 or 3 or 4 hours is amazing in terms of engagement. Board games can teach cooperation and the folly of zero-sum games. Thank you. And I have to say, when I put this one up, my wife laughed out loud. Because she knows some of the guys in my gaming group. And she's like, they're not cooperative. They're so much other than people like that. And I said, yeah, but here's what I'm thinking about. We have games like Pandemic, games like Arkham Horror, games like Spirit Island, these cooperative games, where it's players working together to beat the game. And so I started going through my head, what if you had a whole generation of children raised on cooperative games, working together to beat the system or beat the whatever the problem is? What kind of mindsets would you develop? We know play is fundamental to building social bonds. through play, it builds these tight social structures. We know also in terms of learning and e-learning that simulations are one of the most effective learning methods. And we also know that replay, like when you play a game, you put it up, you bring it back down, you play it again, you play it again. This replay helps develop a learning mindset. So all these great things that I actually kind of half serious, maybe more than half serious about this proposition. But again, the point isn't about board games, it's just the lens in which I see board games. And this lens that I look at board games is this, when I look at them, I see the same thing in things like facilitation or workshops or canvases like the business model canvas or models, stories, coaching, all of these things, toolkits, frames. To me, they're all kind of playing the same role. What I see are facilitating structures, and that is loosely defining these as playful structures that empower people to create, to discover, and to improve together as one mind. And that's what I really want to unpack and explore tonight. So again, what I want to share today is a lens by which we can view the work we do, reconsider the work we already do, and see things we don't yet do. So the first place to start, before I give you examples, which will be the bulk of this talk, is really just why care? Why is this important in the first place? I just want to highlight 3 reasons. First one's pretty straightforward, and since at least the 1970s, different people in organizational development and coaching have been talking about this. It just makes the places we work in more human. We can connect more with people, we can be ourselves, we can be whole, we can be authentic. And this has shown up in a number of ways, a number of books over the years. It's usually a from X to Y sort of mapping. Right now, one of the sites I go to a lot is the Corporate Rebels. And these brothers have been traveling the world, visiting the really places where workers are engaged and enjoy their work, they're having a good time, the companies are successful. And they've identified these 8 trends. I won't go through these, but they're things like from rules and control to freedom and trust, from secrecy to radical transparency. And you see these ideas of like radical candor and vulnerability and authenticity show up in different ways. One of the groups I'm working with out of Northern California, they talk a lot about ego-free leadership. That's the title of their book. And they talk about moving from an ego system, where it's very much about protecting our egos, to moving to an ecosystem, where you have co-responsibility and risk-taking without fear of punishment, passion and commitment, the excitement of learning, all these great, wonderful things. So it creates better places to work and be human, but more so, I see this growing trend, which is the world is becoming more and more complex. The problems we face are increasingly complex, and the finite resources are depleting, and we have to think more consciously about everything we have. And so you look at this, and I've been looking at dozens of different fields outside of design. So looking at product management, looking at lean, looking at agile, things that are adjacent. But then going further out, and looking at digital transformation, management, leadership, organizational change, organizational development, the startup culture, entrepreneurship, learning and development, K through 12 education. That's actually my background. Complexity sciences, systems thinking, games, and play. I've been looking at all these fields, and while the words differ, they're all saying the same thing. They're all pointing to in the same direction. They're all saying this: for complex challenges, we need learning that is open and shared, self-directed, collaborative, just in time and in context. So don't pull us out of our day-to-day work for training, like let the learning happen on the job in the moment. Continuous, integrated. Again, the words change from domain to domain, but they're all saying the same thing. And just to show an example of why this thinking is needed, I've just cherry-picked this one example, and you'll see why in a moment. This is maybe a traditional view of a risk and how we might do risk model. We put things on a matrix, X and Y and Z. And if with this type of model, and this type of framework, we would say, well, clearly the stuff in the upper right, in the red, those are the things that we need to deal with. But if we were to look at the same data with a different model, pivot our frame, you might end up with more of a network map like this. And at this point, you might actually say, well, those red things actually might not be our biggest concerns. We should actually look at these because they're the most networked. And if something was happened there, the contagion effect with the outbreak would be terrible. And that's I look at this, I'm like, wait a second, that reminds me of Pandemic, which if you played it, Pandemic, it's about fighting outbreaks of diseases. It's one of the cooperative games I mentioned. Again, games could make the world a better place, the right kind of games. All right, finally, and this I throw this in more for this audience, this is increasingly where I see the role of design, by extension research, headed. And I just wrote an article recently for Adobe that unpacks my reasons and my argument for this in much more depth. It's 2,000 words on why I think this is the case. Adobe facilitating structures, it should be in the top results. But let me just pick a few examples here. I drew up this then and now, and this is not comprehensive. This is just a few things top of mind, but you know, I feel like then, and you can define then however you want, design and style guide was the big thing. Now, get teams to adopt the design system is the bigger design challenge. And this one, by the way, I had never thought about until I heard Nathan Curtis speaking, and Nathan Curtis, of course, is the design systems person, wizard, guru, whatever title you want to use. And when he talked about the challenges, actually creating the design system, what he called outputs, was one of like 5 things. And the other 4 challenges all had to do with culture change. And getting people to adopt the system, how do you maintain multiple versions, competition. I watched, we chatted afterwards, I'm like, that's all change management. Like that's not so much about design systems anymore. It used to be do customer research. Those of you are researchers. Now it's teach others how to do research or how to do 80% of the research that you do. Make things easy to use. Used to be the mantra, now it's make things that don't harm people. Increase page views and clicks. That used to be the goal. Now it's like, how do we advocate for truly user experience focus? How do we advocate for less engagement, respecting people's attention? Manage a design team might have been the thing then, and still probably is for many of you. But increasingly, I see the role of manager changing to that of coach. Now it's about coaching people and bringing people on, changing the role. There are other design leaders saying similar things. One I wanted to call out here was Hugh Dubberly, and in a talk he gave about this time last year at, I believe, Yale. He talked about problems with problems, and he basically went through 70 slides tearing down the idea of design as problem solving, and he has all his reasons why design as problem solving is problematic. And then he ended near the end with what design, or at least where design is headed, what it really is about. And what I wanted to call out here was what's in the right-hand column, the second-order design. In particular, this phrase. He says, second-order design is about creating the conditions for systems to emerge in which others can design for themselves. And I read that, I'm like, that sounds like things I've been talking about with facilitating structures and helping others figure out things for themselves. All right, so if that seems heavy and daunting, let's bring it down to back to earth with just some everyday examples of how this type of thinking and mindset can show up. So this will be chapter 2 in our little site. And in all of these, I'm going to share some small case studies, but the most important thing isn't the actual tool or the case study or any of the things, the surface stuff. It's the principles behind it. And I've identified 12 principles, and again, not every case study embraces all of these. They'll embrace like 3 or 4 or 5, and I'll call out which principles are being modeled or shown for each of these case studies. There's also some verbs that I'll ask us to reflect on. And this was something, as I pulled this talk together, this is one of the things I discovered and learned on my own, which was we have a whole list of verbs that we have decades, if not centuries, that we've really gotten good at. Things like execute, evaluate, and decide. And there are a number of tools to make decisions, right? What's right, what's wrong, right? What's the best option? But words like discover, generate, improve, I felt like we have a much shorter time span for developing our fluency at these types of things, maybe a few decades, right, to get really good at these types of things. And so I'm going to comment on what type of verbs we model in case studies as well. All right, so the first of these case studies, here's the challenge. How do we get teams to stop taking on bad and or poorly framed problems? And so I did a lot of thinking about this back, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago. I gave a talk on it at a conference, the IA Summit, now the IA Conference. And it was called Stop Doing What You're Told. It was all about recognizing and spotting these types of bad problem statements. And my belief was, and still is, that if you can name something, then you can recognize it. So if you can name the bad problems, which I did, gave them like 14 or 15 names, then you're more likely to recognize them. That talk, while it was good, it was long. Like, imagine me going through a laundry list of 14 bad problem statements. It's a good talk, it's good information, everyone was soaking it up, but it's not a great talk. So what I tried to do, one of the subsequent times I gave it, was actually make it more interesting with a bingo sheet, so you could follow along and cross it off. Yeah, that didn't work so well. You know, there's a place for them, but it wasn't there. And then I started reflecting on it. The content's good, the material's good. Why do I need to be the one delivering? What if I restructured this in such a way that people could engage with the content? Because that's really the goal with it. It's not to hear me go on for 45 minutes or in a workshop for several hours. And so I kind of flipped things around, and I created this sort of game where I would write the bad problem statements on the back and the side here, and then you flip it over and actually names and talks about it. And instead of me talking, going through these, I gave a little bit of a setup, and I said, here, you know, get in groups, play this game, spread out all the blue side, the problem statements, and to make it a game, I mixed in some good problem statements. I said, as a group, you decide if this is good or bad, and before you commit to it being bad, try to articulate why you think it is. And then check yourself and flip it over. And so I've watched people do this. It often looks like this. You see all the smiles on their faces, and they're going through, and you'll see this moment where people will grab a card, they'll flip it over, and the whole table, oh, we'll do all that, right? And they're engaged in this. And probably the best compliment I ever got on this was, have you played this with this other group? And that word play, I was like, yes. Like, it's not a game in the literal sense, but it's evoking game-like and playful qualities. So the real takeaway from this was moving from passive learning, and I understand the irony of this right here, moving from passive learning to active learning, where people are engaged with the content and on their own terms. And I'm there in the background to clarify, why is this bad? So the principles here: 1, active learning; 2, learning feels like play; and then no facilitator required. I'm not saying no facilitator, but no facilitator required. Facilitation is happening with the tool, with the toolkit and the conversation. And then I'm there in the background if I need to be. All right, so I would call that discovering the known. So in that case, I've identified something that was known, these named things, and the process was discovering that. So let's move down a bit, something not quite at the other extreme of generate, but kind of in between. How do we prepare trainers, like workshop trainers, facilitation trainers, for challenging situations? So this is one that comes up where you can go through all the nuts and bolts and mechanics of facilitation, but the things that are troubling are, what happens when you have only the same person answering all your questions? What happens if you have people just zoning out and grabbing their phones and doing this? Like, how do you handle those situations? In my mindset, I was thinking very much like the cards. Like, someone out there somewhere has identified all the common problems and how to solve them. And so I was expecting something like that, but instead I got something very different. In a training I was going through on facilitation, rather than give you the answers, they said, we've identified the most common challenges. So they identified challenging situations and later challenging behaviors. And so they had identified about 24 of these challenging behaviors and situations, but then they had it blank. And they said, you're the experts, you figure out how you would handle the situation. Like, in this room, there's a lot of knowledge. And so they got up and did kind of like speed dating thing, and for 20, 30 minutes, we all ran around and paired off and said, okay, domineering personalities, trying to dominate the session. How would you handle that? Have you ever had this? What do you do? Have you heard someone? And we collectively built up this bank of knowledge in that room. It wasn't just the facilitator and what they brought to the room, it's what we brought to the room. It was just an amazing experience. And so I looked at that and I reflected on, 1, scaffolding, not solutions. They gave us the scaffolding. They had identified the common challenging situations and behaviors. But then 2, is diverse experiences, everyone in the room, everyone going through that course, over the expertise of the facilitator. I think that's something incredibly valuable that I'm looking for us to embrace more and more. I backed into diversity by way of this, thinking about cognitive diversity, and the fact that we all have different backgrounds and upbringings and different cultures and different experiences leads us to have a different point of view and a different set of experiences. And I look at that and I'm like, that's more valuable than the expertise of one person. All right, let's move on fully to the generate. generate ideas, generate options, solutions. So this is something I did with the team at the last company I was at. Here was the challenge: how do we get designers to engage with AI and machine learning topics? Being a big fan of self-directed learning, letting people teach themselves, I had this idea: I'll issue a challenge, attach a deadline to it, and that'll equal success. So the challenge was take on something related to AI and machine learning. In 6 weeks, we'll have like a science fair type exhibit, show what you learned. It'll be great. Didn't equal success. People need a little more nudging, a little more structure than that. So after another unsuccessful reboot, by the third time I did it, I actually introduced something new, which was a bit of a learning plan. And this was me going back and doing my research on self-directed learning and project-based learning in K-12 schools. And oftentimes there's a generic set of 8 or 10 questions that can help the learner reflect on what they want to learn, what the first 3 steps are they're going to take, these types of things. And in doing so, provides enough structure and enough scaffolding to get started down the learning path. And so I came up with something like this. The questions are pretty generic on these self-directed learning things. I may have slipped in AI or machine learning in a few cases. But the whole goal was to kind of structure that learning. The success this third time around was much better than the first 2 times. So some things I learned there, probably the most important thing, which I'm reminded of again, is just enough structure and no more. If anything, I tend to err on the side of not enough structure. So this was another reminder, what's just enough structure to facilitate the learning, but not start preaching and lecturing. And if you've seen any of my past presentations, one I gave in 2014 that was really a defining moment for me personally was when I started distinguishing between paths and sandboxes. Paths being things that people have scripted for you, and you'll never get more than what's planned. Sandboxes being these open generative play spaces where people can do amazing things that we can never predict. And the exemplars I held up were a game like Candy Crush as a path, right? You'll never surprise the group who made the game because they played everything out. Minecraft, on the other hand, if you played in it, it's like a virtual bin of Lego bricks, and there are amazing creations that the creator would have never foreseen that people have done with that. And I love this quote. This is about games. Sandbox and playground design both let the players do what they want instead of forcing one way to play. I would change it just slightly and say sandbox and playground design both let the learners do what they want instead of forcing one way to learn. Alas, sandboxes aren't for everyone and for every situation. And that's something I've had to learn and still learning. And I think one model that I came across that helped me with this was the will skill matrix from coaching. And basically they say there are 4 types of learners on this will skill matrix, and there are those who you need to guide, those who you need to direct, those where you just delegate, they run off running, and those that you need to excite, and then they can figure it out on their own. I took that and kind of rotated it 45 degrees, and I put it on this continuum from hyper control, you will learn this, and this is how you will learn it, to chaos. And I think I'm learning now to know when is it chaos, when is it delegation, when do I need to guide or excite, and that's not the same as control. All right, so let's go to our third verb, which is a different type of thing: to improve, to iterate, to make something better. And it can be improve your performance of something, it can be to improve your understanding. So in this case, here's the challenge. How do we help teams craft great, insert whatever type, vision, problem, story, etc. statements? And this is something I've seen over and over as a trainer, is you'll get training on the Mad Lib statement to use, or you'll get training on like, here's how to do this, and maybe a few good examples are sprinkled in. But then people go out and they go to do it on their own, write the agile story or do this, and it's like the things that are produced aren't that good. And so my question was, how can we fix this? How can we make sure that that learning sticks, or that people really understand the nuance of these things and not just, I got the basic idea. And there's a lot of things, bold vision statements and metrics, writing good measures or metrics. That's actually really hard skill to develop. OKRs, customer problem statements, your pitch, right? How can you get under 10 seconds or under 5 words? Email headlines. There's all of these short format things that really are a skill or a craft that you need to get better at. And so in large organizations, I see 2 common ways. that this is done. One is through the half-day training. We're going to train you on how to do this thing. Now go off, good luck, right? On the other, that's very efficient, right? You can put everyone in the room for a day, do the training, send them on their way. The other extreme, it's very effective, but it's very costly, and that's to like swarm a team with 1 or 2 coaches and have those coaches coach that team on these different things, how to do them really well. Very effective, but not very efficient. And so what I was wondering was, is there something, again, embracing this idea of no facilitator required, is there something that can be created using technology that's both efficient and effective? And so I have this idea I've been prototyping. It's on the back burner at this point, but it's one of those things that maybe in the future I'll build out. And it would be, you could put in something like a bold vision statement or your library of statements to choose from. And along with this would be those check yourself sort of heuristics or questions that separate the badly written questions that follow the structure from the really great ones. And so in this case, it has to be a really good statement, but let me show you just a quick mock-up of how this would work. You have your statement that someone submitted, and this is all crowdsourced, peer-to-peer. So in this case, land the moon on the moon, return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. So you say, yeah, I want to give feedback on this. Give your feedback, and then it would walk you through the 5 or 6 or 7 kind of check yourself questions. So instead of just open feedback like you would get on the blog or a thread or something, it's structured. So does this statement describe what, not how? You can answer yes or no. It's a binary question. Do you find this inspiring? So that's a soft, squishy thing. It could be no, math, yes. It could be a slider of some sort, but just do you find it inspiring? Land the man on the moon, return safely. Highlight the deadline. So is there a deadline in this? So you highlight it by the end of the decade, and then hit next. And as we continue on, highlight how success has been measured, and so on. So the point here then is you've taken those. In this case, there's 7 things you can use to check to see if it's a good, bold problem statement. And you're actually nudging people or putting a scaffolding there such that the feedback is structured around those questions. Instead of it is good, what do you think about it? It's like, show me these things, because we know these things separate the good ones from the ones that aren't so good. And so here's the traditional way where you go through the training, someone tells you how to do it, and you're left on your own to do it. But here are the 2 very subtle but critical additions. We've added the structure, the heuristics, the check yourself questions, and we put in peer-to-peer feedback. So suddenly all of the feedback isn't coming from the trainer or the coach, it's coming from your peers, and they've got the scaffolding to provide structured critique and feedback. All right, so principles here, learning is social, you're learning from each other. And by the way, when you're a peer giving feedback, you're also now thinking about these things and how to get better at them. Scaffolding, not solutions, and no facilitator required. All right, let's go back full circle, full triangle around to discover, but I want to show a different kind of discover scenario. So in this case, how do we make complex social issues approachable and understandable by all? And I want to point to some of the work that Nikki Case is doing with explorable explanations. These are basically like playful simulations, things you can play with. Nikki has put data in, and you can play with it to see the outcomes of these things. And they're complex things. In this case, Parable of the Polygons, it's an interactive simulation based on a prize-winning paper on desegregation. And so we can talk about desegregation, we can have our opinions, but it's another thing to put in data and start to play with the variables and see what happens. And that's exactly what Nikki's done here. And so I think, yeah, I've got the video here. By the time you get to the end of the page, there's a lot more variables, and you can play this out over time and see, based upon your initial set to the end, does this result in segregation again or not? What are the things that hold communities in equilibrium? Again, this is a simulation version of the white paper that was written in the late 1970s, I believe. And Nikki has a number of things like this, and there are other people doing these as well, but now we're able to take complex data sets and these complex things and start to model and play with them and see what actually happens. Not just my opinion, my beliefs, but let's model this out, let's play it out and see where this goes. So things here, shared understanding as the outcome, top of mind. That's one of the key things I see from tools like this. Learning feels like play. It feels like a video game or something you're playing with. No facilitator required. The other things. So I could go on with more examples, but you're starting to see how these principles show up in different ways. Hopefully that's what we've seen at this point. Again, it's not about the things, and we could talk about more things like facilitation canvases, Mad Lib statements, and these card decks and toolkits. It's really about the principles behind them, the principles governing them. So that's part of why in the sheet I gave everyone tonight, I put out the principles, because this is, to me, the takeaway from this, the principles and what they mean and how they might be applied. There were a few things I wanted to call out there, give special attention to. Psychological safety and group cognition were the two. If I was like, I had to cut everything and only focus on two, what would they be? I wrote these down. And it was funny, like within the same week, I came across this article talking about cognitive diversity, which is a word, and psychological safety, and like essentially the same two principles I've identified. And they're talking about teams, and the most successful teams are both cognitively diverse and psychologically safe. So let me unpack what each of these means. Psychological safety is an idea that's become popular in the past, I'd say 4 years since Google released the report on effective teams. Google had studied 200 teams and was trying to find the common denominator among successful teams. Ends up being this idea of psychological safety, which actually didn't originate with Google. It goes back to the late 90s with research being done by Edmondson. And psychological safety is basically the feeling of like I feel safe being my full self, being authentic, and speaking my mind and sharing with others without fear of repercussion, or fear that people hold me against me, or fear that people will judge me in some way. And I'll just read this quote from Amy Edmondson. She says, ultimately, the one sustainable competitive advantage that a company can have is a culture that enables its people and the entire organization to learn faster. Fast learning has to come from a place of people feeling safe to talk about what's working and what's not working, of recognizing that their job is not to appear perfect, but to get better. And I love that last phrase, appear perfect, get better. One of the trainings I'm doing with that group out of Northern California is how sometimes our image or our ego trips us up. And sometimes our desire to manage how we appear gets ahead of the goals and the outcomes that we're after, especially collectively. So I said that was the end of the examples. I'll give you one more. How do we help members of a newly formed team share their concerns? Again, this isn't exactly psychological safety, but it's the types of things that would get you there. A typical brainstorming process for a new team launching something. They might say, let's brainstorm what might go wrong with this project. The problem is, if you're in that new team and you don't know these people, and you're being asked now to share what you think will go wrong, and you may think the whole idea is stupid, why is the company investing money in it, right? You're not gonna say that, because suddenly you'll be branded as the naysayer, the negative person, right? There's not a safe space to voice those concerns. And yet, that is the time when it's most critical that those concerns be brought up before you get down the path of the project. So it's a simple thing that's been used for a while, but it's the pre-mortem. I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but it's the idea that you do this exercise where you say, okay, I know it's the first day and we're kicking off this project, but let's do a pre-mortem. Let's imagine it's 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and this project failed abysmally, right? So you're creating this space where things have failed. Let's talk about why. Why did it fail? And now you're using fantasy, which is, I think, the interesting thing. You're using fantasy to create a safe space. So now I can share all my concerns and my misgivings, because I'm worried about these things. And there's a safe space. That's not about me. You created the safe space where we can all embrace this game, this role, right? And presume things. So that's a bit about psychological safety. Group cognition. So this one's interesting. I've kind of backed into it as well. I showed this slide earlier. Where does learning happen? Shifting from passive learning to active learning. I want to drill into this a bit more. The book I've been working on for the past too many years will be out in May, and it's about how we work with information as a raw material. And these are some of the ideas that you have to go into it. But there's this whole argument or debate about where does cognition happen? Where's the mind, right? And I think many of us understand the brain isn't here, and yet there are some cases where if I say, what is 4 times 11? Thinking does happen here, but it's because it's this wired association we built up over time. But if I say something like multiply 379 by 413, chances are you'll either pull out a calculator or you pull out pencil and paper, and you'll start working the problem out. And now the thinking space is not just here, but it's in our immediate space with the tools and the paper and the things we're using. Well, if we play this out even more, then suddenly when we have other people in the room and other tools, other perspectives, that cognitive space has increased. And so I've become increasingly interested in this part, which is when information is contained in people, how do you manage people to coordinate information and get group sharing and that's ultimately group cognition. And this is not groupthink. This is not everyone thinking the same way. This is about bringing that diversity and friction into a constructive, safe space. So where understanding takes place depends on upon what resources we use and the complexity of the problem. Now, here's where it gets interesting and back to the group cognition. We all have our own wirings and collection of neurons from our however many decades we've been on this earth. And when we're asked to solve a problem, we're all solving it based on our experiences and what we've accumulated. And now imagine that you can create the space, whether it's through technology or tools or just psychology, where suddenly we can speak freely and start to share. You end up with something like this, where we have a much richer thinking space. And that's how I would, in a very quick 2-minute space, introduce group cognition. It's something really powerful. So the biggest challenge is actually this, losing control. And I know it's oftentimes we talk about organizations and how they need to trust us more, but it also applies to any of us who are in leadership positions. And so I actually want to start there. I'm going to put up a bunch of statements, and these came from a book called Managing for Happiness. Again, a book that's in line with all these ideals. Would you read through these? I'll read a few of them. How can we motivate workers? How can we change the organizational culture? How can we change the mindset of the managers? How can we get teams to take responsibility? How can we develop people's competencies? I think these are all questions we've probably been in the meeting and they come up and we've talked about. But I want you to look and see if you notice a theme in all of these, a potentially negative theme. Would you look for something?
Seems like we're trying to force something onto the organization.
Yeah, they're all about how can we change other people. And it starts from this mindset of I know more, I'm better equipped to deal with these more complex issues. Now we expect everyone to bend to my will. And this one, when I read about this in Managing for Happiness, it really hit home for me. Because if you had asked me about influence and leadership 6 years ago, I would have talked to you about changing hearts and minds and painting the compelling vision and winning people to your side and marching them into battle, whatever it may be, right? And there's a subtext in there, which is you're trying to get everyone to embrace the mental model, your idea behind your agenda. You're in there, your ego is in there. If you ask me now about personal influence, I'm like, I'll talk about it, but I'm more interested in talking about working and learning together. And this wasn't an easy thing for me to learn and something I'm still learning, but yeah, the idea here is it's not my model that's right. In fact, there's a good chance I'm wrong. So I'm eager to actually learn together and learn what I don't know. And there's all different techniques and things to enter into this, and ways to ask questions, ways to practice listening. But what's nice about this is it creates a shared emergent model for everyone who's actively working together on the problem, which I think is much more powerful. There's another book I read last year, Unlocking the Leadership Mind Traps, How to Thrive in Complexity. And these are the 5 mind traps they identified. I'll just highlight 3 here: brightness, control, and ego. Things that are mind traps for leaders and will make it hard to solve complex problems. So that's losing control as a leader. Let's now shift to losing control as an organization. And let me start with, I think, how most or many organizations run, and I'll just read this through. This is from a book called Liberating Structures. And this is a pyramid for a reason. It's the top-down hierarchical model. And they say most often what happens is the leader identifies the problem and endorses a best practice intervention, often developed by experts, usually outside experts, Kinsey's, Baines, whatever, right? The leader sponsors the training program to be cascaded down the organization. A series of communication strategies are implemented to generate buy-in and overcome local resistance to change. See lots of you smiling. You feel like you've gone through this, maybe? Yeah. Frontline workers are expected to replicate the best practices with tight fidelity, i.e. no deviation. So that's a pretty common model, the top-down expert-driven change model. And then the irony of it is oftentimes the bulk of the organization's sensing capacity resides in the frontline workers, the people who are interacting with the customers on a daily basis, but they're often cut off from the decision-making process. So that's the challenge that we're living in right now, or many organizations are living in. And I love how this quote summed it up. This is from Lee Sharp, working on 21st century organizations. We have to change almost everything about the way in which we meet our material needs, and quickly, but we are in the wrong organizational vehicle to make that change. Our hierarchical structures hinder the sensing of emergent issues and thus innovation. And again, it's not about down with hierarchy and up with flat structure. It's much more nuanced than that, but it's all about becoming more networked and independent and a sensing organization so you can respond to change, respond to new things that happen and new discoveries. The best explanation I've heard was if you take the familiar, like the 20th century, we had industrial factories, and in the future we'll have like everyone working together, kind of Star Trek, nice future. It's not quite that binary. Yeah, we have the industrial factories and we have the very, you're a cog in the machine, right? But most companies, to be fair, don't treat their employees like cogs in the machine. In fact, you often hear, and it's often true, employees are our most valuable asset. The problem is we now have all these classes and courses on how to have radical candid conversations, how to be vulnerable, how to have grit. So we're treating our employees and preaching the right things, but the structure, the vehicle that we're in, is the old structure. So it's like we changed half the model, but we haven't changed to embrace new structures, new ways. When I read that, I'm like, that's a good distillation of the transition. We're talking a long, decades-long transition. So there's hope for change. And I was encouraged when I came across this, because sometimes you can feel like, oh, I'm just like swimming upstream, like this is a futile effort. But in that same book, Liberating Structures, they talk about the ways things change, the ways culture change. They talk about beliefs and changing those. They talk about values. But the one they focused on, and the one that resonated with me, was changing habits. And they say by changing habits, that can actually start to push on beliefs and values and change those. And I started looking at my role in kind of a middle management layer, saying, what can I do to change habits? And I started looking at ways I had changed habits in tiny ways and how that rippled throughout the system. And so I started thinking about that more. And if you look at systems theory and systems thinking, people will say you can't change the system. What you can do is make tiny tweaks to the rules that govern the system and then see what happens. And what happens may not be what you expected or predicted, but you make tiny changes, they ripple throughout the system, you watch, and then you adjust and make more changes. And so I believe culture and systems change comes through hundreds or thousands of small, subtle, but significant choices. So when you're at the end of the presentation, and in an earlier version, I just ended with examples of choices, but really my goal is I want to make sure you're kind of rocking this and really understanding these. So I'm going to do what grade school teachers do. I'm going to check for understanding at this point. Sound good? And I'm going to go through a few quick situations. We won't discuss these. Again, there's no right answer. They're meant to be generative questions for you to reflect on and really look at these 12 principles. But I'm going to briefly describe a situation, and you determine which principles are relevant. Again, I'm not asking you to tell me what you do or how you solve the problem. I just want you to do the intermediary step, which is which principles do you think would be relevant to the situation I described. You are permitted to laugh out loud if this sounds familiar. All right. You're deciding whether to make your Slack team channels private or public. And tiny decision, but it might have ripple effects throughout the system. So which principle or principles might come into play? Again, quiet reflection. There's several. Something about open participation might be good. Social safety. Yep. All right, again, there are no right answers. I'm just wanting to try this out, test it out. All right, you're on the leadership team. and you're writing, I'm going to write a couple of you, you're writing out OKRs for the quarter. Do you include the whole team, like everyone, or just the leads? And this has been debated because it's like, it would be unwieldy to include everyone, but so it just needs to be the leads. But then there are other people say, if they're not people aren't involved, they don't care about them or unknown. So again, I'm not going to answer. I have opinions, but OKR, objective and key results. Thank you for asking that. Yes. Yeah, objectives and key results. It's a way to measure things. Shared understanding the outcome would be definitely a great one.
Collective ownership.
Collective ownership. All right. You going through these? Are you enjoying this? Yes. All right. All right, this one's more aimed at some not managers or leaders, specifically designers. Do you share your work in progress? In progress. We're talking about it's in that formative early stage and you're not very proud of it. More to the point, would you share your files for early half-baked ideas? I can tell you in my experience, what I've noticed is, one, there's a reluctance to share stuff until it's ready to share, which is usually too late. And then even more so, like I've had people share presentations they're working on or other things. I'm like, oh, can you give me the file? And there's like, like there's this fear, like if I give you the file, then I don't know what, there's all sorts of fears wrapped up in that.
Active learning.
Active learning, learning is social, open participation, collective ownership, shared understanding, psychological safety, do they or I feel safe? There's several of these that come with that. Okay, the big presentation is next week. You're a manager in this role. Do you let team members present their own work? I've heard people talk about why the team member isn't ready to present. But think about the principles. Experiences over expertise, share. There's a collective ownership. Yeah. Loss of control. Ooh. Yeah, some of you were like, I would never do that, or that feels uncomfortable. No facilitator required. All right, similar situation. The CEO has asked for honest and direct feedback, but you're concerned that some members of your team might say things that reflect poorly on your group. Safety, control. Feels like play. After a day of brainstorming that wrapped up with a dot voting exercise, several people now feel excluded by the outcomes. By the way, I wrote a rant on the problems with dot voting exercises on Medium. It's the most read thing I've ever written. And I unpacked this in great detail and some of the harmful things that are done with dot voting exercises. Dot voting being you put sticky dots, usually 3, on the best ideas, right? And I've been in many cases where people voted on, well, there's all sorts of reasons why votes went to things that maybe weren't the best ideas, or there are other ideas that need exploration. So, popularity contest, or there's all sorts of psychology involved. I came up with this one thinking specifically about shared understanding as the outcome. In particular, I've seen people work so hard to do a half-day or all-day workshop to get everyone on the same page, and they pull the rug out from under that in the last 30 minutes with a dot voting exercise that marginalizes and undoes all the good conversations that preceded it. My best recommendation is don't ever use dot voting to vote. Use dot voting to continue the conversation. A speaker at a local meetup wants to make sure others completely understand what they just presented. Active learning, maybe? Learning feels like play. With hundreds of teams, this is one I had to learn, with hundreds of teams, your org needs a consistent process across all teams, but you also want to allow individual teams to do what they determine works best for their objectives. Loss of control, just enough structure, no more. You are responsible for the accessibility of your products. You recognize this is a topic that other people on the team need to understand and care about if there is to be any real change. I included this one, by the way, because a friend of mine, Olivia Labate, she shared online what she was doing with the accessibility guidelines, and to me it was like facilitating structures. She basically issued a challenge to the engineering team, or the rest of the, mostly the engineering group. So she issued a challenge to read a little bit from the guidelines every day, and she broke it down into bite-sized chunks and had check-ins and like celebrations at the end of each week, and reminders. And I was like, you're facilitating learning. You're taking, instead of saying, here, read this, you should learn about it, care about it, she broke it down to bite-sized challenges. So learning as play, learning as social, just enough structure, no more scaffolding, not solutions. She was just trying to get people engaged with some of the guidelines and principles. You're working on an end-to-end customer journey. This is to designers now, okay, to specifically, or researchers. You're working on an end-to-end customer journey for your company. Who is invited to participate? Learning is social, there's collective ownership and open participation and loss of control. Should it be just a design activity? Yeah, that's the reason I included this one, is I've seen designers say, you know how to do journey maps, you know how to do blueprints, other people don't understand the process, we're too crazy and they don't get it, it'll derail our conversations. I'm like, yeah, but what are you gonna lose if you don't include it? All right, it's another thing that you produce, it's another us versus them. One more. Big changes are coming. How much time is spent crafting the narrative? Phrase that is now a hot button. Yeah, and which principles does it not go along with? It's control, shared understanding is the outcome, because there's an understanding we want you to have if you're crafting that narrative. Psychological safety, you don't know what's going on for real.
And actually, that's an interesting place to apply learning and play.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to make a big change and like energy around that change, getting people engaged in using that energy in a way that facilitates some change versus inhibits a change, be a big important step.
Yeah. And I put things on a kind of continuum here. And if you have the raw facts on one end, just giving people the raw facts, put off record here, raw facts usually isn't good, because then people are left to spiral and form their own stories, which are often wrong. That's just how we behave as human behaviors. So just up from raw facts is thoughtful framing. Or like, here are the facts, here's what's going on, here's the story, here's the narrative. And it's thoughtful framing, meaning this is honest, authentic, it's real, we just want you to understand the facts through what's actually happening. And as you swing out over here on the other end, you have lies, right? And I often find that attempts to control the narrative are often closer to lies. And that what's interesting is thoughtful framing leads to, oh, I get it, or oh, that makes sense, right? In a way that the raw facts wouldn't have. But the crafting the narrative leads to either people who are nodding their heads like, this is awesome, or like, wait a second, I'm ticked off because now I know the truth. The alternative facts, right? So that's just kind of how I think. All right, so I want to leave you with an uncomfortable challenge, a little fun clip here. Let me make sure the video or the audio is going to work. This is a clip taken out of context from Stranger Things, but I think it's a perfect ending to this talk. Let's see if the audio will work here. Second. And
Is it turned off?
it turned off. It's like I'm back on. Okay, what did it do?
High-tech audio system.
Fingers crossed. Everyone cross their fingers for the best. All right.
That might be you.
All right. Let's try. So. Yeah. Loss of control. I know that.
I know this is a difficult
Hey!
conversation to have.
Control.
I hope you know that I care about you very much. And I know that you,
Eye contact.
and I know that you both care about each other very much. This does not sound like me at all.
Just keep going.
Which is why I think it's important to establish these boundaries moving forward.
No looking, you know this. Come on.
So we can build an environment where we all feel comfortable and trusted and open
Share our feelings.
to sharing our feelings. This isn't going to work.
Yes, it will. I promise. Come on.
Maybe just kill Mike. I'm the chief of police. I can cover it up.
Thought that was a great parallel of an old way of thinking and a newer way of thinking. And I'll just end with this. Establish these boundaries moving forward so we can build an environment where we all feel comfortable and trusted and open to sharing. This will work, I promise. With that, thank you very much.